Welcome to a deep dive into your sources. Today, we're sifting through quite a collection of recent news and analysis from across the Asia Pacific. We're pulling insights from places like the Associated Press, Bangkok Post, South China Morning Post, CNA, BBC, and the Taipei Times. Our aim here is to quickly give you the most important nuggets, really focusing on today's top stories, and, as you asked, taking a closer look at that whole U.S.-China tariff situation and how those tensions are playing out across countries, from Japan and Korea all the way down through Southeast Asia.
Exactly. We're going to try and zoom in on the high-level trade talks first, then sort of connect those dots, see the tangible effects these big disputes are having on the ground. And what's, well, an incredibly dynamic region. It's a complex picture, definitely. And what really stands out is just how deeply interconnected all these economies actually are.
Yeah, that interconnectedness is key, isn't it? So let's unpack this. According to your sources, what's the current state of play, in this really significant U.S.-China trade dynamic? Where do things stand right now?
Well, okay, the sources confirm there are indeed high-level delegations from both the U.S. and China meeting right now. In London, actually.
London, okay. Interesting location. And what's the tone or the objective of these talks, based on the reporting?
Well, what seems significant is how they're being described, explicitly as an attempt to, quote, shore up a fragile truce in this ongoing trade dispute. Sources like AP, SCMP, Taipei Times all mention this. And they note these talks are happening after that phone call between President Trump and President Xi. That call seemed to open the door a bit.
Fragile truce. Yeah, that phrase itself tells you quite a lot, doesn't it? Sort of managing expectations there. And are things stable during these talks, or are other issues already bubbling up?
Well, it sounds like new disputes might already be emerging even as they're meeting. That's according to the AP. And CNA is reporting the talks could potentially stretch into a second day,
Oh, really?
which might hint at, the difficulty of the issues they're trying to tackle. Or maybe progress. Hard to say.
Right? Could go either way. So even just shoring up a fragile truce is proving complicated. What do your sources tell us about the U.S. position or, actions around these talks?
Okay, from the U.S. side, there are a couple of notable points mentioned. First, the U.S. decided not to label China a currency manipulator.
Okay, that's significant.
Yeah, it is significant because that designation, it could open the door to more punitive economic actions by the U.S., but at the same time, they did sharply criticize China's transparency policies.
So a bit of a carrot and stick, maybe. Holding back on the manipulator label, but still hitting them on transparency.
Precisely. It seems like a nuanced position. And interestingly, the SCMP mentions one U.S. official even hinted at a possible reprieve, a reprieve on some tech export restrictions, just as the talks were beginning.
Really? On tech? That's been such a huge point of tension.
Exactly. So it raises this important question about strategy, doesn't it? Is this a genuine concession they're considering, or is it more of a negotiation tactic, trying to set a more positive tone, perhaps?
Fascinating. A potential opening there. Now, looking at China's side, do the sources offer any concrete data or indicators of how the trade war is actually impacting them? Or maybe how they're positioning themselves before these talks?
Yes. Yeah, the sources give us some pretty clear data points showing the impact. China reported its exports to the U.S. fell, well, a really significant 35% in May. That's according to both AP and CNA.
35%. Wow, that number just jumps right out. What does that really tell us?
Well, it gives you a direct, quantifiable glimpse into the economic effects, right? I mean, a 35% drop in exports to a major market like the U.S. in a single month,
Yeah.
that's a serious hit. It really underscores the real-world cost of this whole dispute for Chinese businesses.
Definitely feels real with a number like that. And were there other data points or actions from China that seemed maybe strategically timed?
Yes. The sources also note China's rare earth trade data from May. It's being interpreted as sending a deliberate message just ahead of these talks. It reflects curbs on those exports, highlighting China's control over these strategically important resources that the U.S. really relies on. SCB specifically pointed this out.
Okay. So using their leverage over resources potentially in the negotiations makes sense.
That certainly seems to be the read from the sources, yeah. We also see reactions within China that point to, well, the seriousness of the situation domestically. For example, the tech hub Shenzhen. They launched a strategy with 39 specific points.
39 points?
Yeah, aimed squarely at supporting consumption and exporters amid the trade war. The SCMP highlighted this.
A 39-point plan specifically because of the trade war, that sounds like a significant, pretty proactive effort to mitigate the impact at a local level.
It really does. It shows that local governments are feeling the pressure.
Right.
And they're trying to implement these concrete measures to support businesses facing these challenges.
Yeah.
And it's not just the big picture numbers or government strategies. We see the impact on specific sectors, too. SCMP mentions U.S. soybean farmers, for instance. They're trying to reduce their dependence on China, which was, a massive market for them.
Right.
Though, interestingly, industry insiders still see China as a promising market long term. So it suggests this kind of complicated recalibration is happening.
So farmers are diversifying, trying to, but the underlying market pull is still there. That sounds like a difficult position for them.
Absolutely. And another source, also in the SCMP, highlights how the tariff war is particularly crushing for small U.S. firms
Why small firms specifically?
because of the sheer cost uncertainty. I mean, when tariffs change, suddenly their input costs or their export prices become unpredictable. It makes business planning incredibly difficult, almost impossible sometimes. And small businesses, well, they often don't have the resources, the cushion, to absorb that kind of volatility.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just the final price increase, but the unpredictable swings.
Oh.
Okay, so that gives us a pretty good picture of the direct U.S.-China tensions and some of the impacts within those two countries. Now let's shift our focus, as requested, to that ripple effect. What do your sources tell us about how these tensions are impacting the countries across the Asia-Pacific region?
Yeah, this is where you really see the complexity unfold. The sources touch on this in several ways, showing how different countries are trying to navigate this rivalry. There's one commentary piece in the SCMP that directly asks, is taking sides even a realistic option for Asian markets when they're so deeply squeezed by this U.S.-China competition?
That question alone speaks volumes, doesn't it? About the positions so many of these countries find themselves in. They have significant economic ties to both the U.S. and China.
Exactly. And there's an opinion piece titled Tariff Man Trump versus United Asian. It was in both the Bangkok Post and SCMP. That underscores the regional perspective. It highlights this idea of maybe a collective stance or at least a shared experience in Southeast Asia, suggesting these countries are perhaps finding some common ground in how they respond to the pressure.
United Asian against Tariff Man Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a strong title. It definitely points to a potential regional identity, maybe solidifying a bit in the face of this external pressure. So beyond the high-level commentary, do the sources give us specific, concrete examples? How this ripple effect is playing out on the ground in different countries.
Oh, yes, absolutely. We see some really specific impacts mentioned. Take Taiwan, for example. The Taipei Times reports Taiwan's exports surged last month. Hit a record high, actually.
Okay, record high exports. Sounds great on the surface.
Right, at first glance, it sounds like great news. But the source explicitly states this surge was fueled, at least partly, by front-loaded shipments to the U.S., basically getting goods out ahead of potential future tariff shifts.
Wow. Front-loaded shipments. Explain what that tells us. What does that detail reveal?
Well, that detail is a perfect illustration of companies reacting directly, immediately to the tariff threat. Businesses are speeding up their exports now. They're trying to get goods into the U.S. before new tariffs might suddenly make them more expensive down the line. It shows this uncertainty isn't just theoretical, right? It's directly driving business decisions, distorting normal trade patterns. It's causing these immediate tactical moves by companies.
Yeah, that gives you such a direct insight into how the uncertainty, the threat of the trade war translates into real action on the ground for businesses in Taiwan.
It really does. And also related to Taiwan and U.S. policy, the Taipei Times notes that Taiwan was named on the U.S. Treasury's monitoring list, the one for macroeconomic and foreign exchange policies.
Right, the monitoring list. What does being on that list actually mean for Taiwan?
Well, it's not punitive, like being called a currency manipulator, but it does signal increased scrutiny from the U.S. scrutiny of Taiwan's currency practices and its broader economic policies. So it just adds another layer to that economic relationship with the U.S. happening at the same time as these trade tensions with China are playing out. It shows how U.S. economic engagement in the region is, well, multifaceted.
Okay. So moving south into Southeast Asia, then, are we seeing similar kinds of impacts or maneuvering, maybe?
Absolutely. Look at Vietnam. The BBC reports on China's President Xi urging Vietnam to oppose bullying. And this is happening right as President Trump is reportedly considering more tariffs.
So China is explicitly linking its outreach to Vietnam, linking it to the pressure they're feeling from the U.S. on trade. Is that the implication?
That's how the sources seem to frame it, yes.
Right.
And the BBC also reports that President Trump reportedly called this meeting a ploy by Xi, a ploy to figure out how to, quote, screw the U.S.
Wow. That's a very blunt language.
extremely blunt. But this exchange, if it's reported accurately, it really highlights the intense geopolitical maneuvering happening in the region. Countries like Vietnam, with significant trade relationships with both powers, they're potentially being courted or put in really difficult positions,
Yeah.
caught in the middle.
Yeah, that's a stark illustration, isn't it? Of the level of mistrust and the strategic competition that's influencing these regional relationships. Are there economic impacts visible in Vietnam too?
Well, it's not directly tied to the trade war in the source itself, but CNA does report that Vietnam's EV maker, VinFast, reported a pretty significant net loss in Q1.
Hmm. Okay.
Now, the global electric vehicle market is definitely a sector where U.S.-China competition is incredibly intense. So while the loss itself might have multiple causes, it's happening within this broader market dynamic, a dynamic that's heavily influenced by major power competition and these trade tensions, especially in tech and auto sectors.
That makes sense. Yeah, even if it's not a direct tariff hit, that larger competitive landscape shaped by these tensions, it definitely impacts companies in those key sectors. What about other countries in the region? Singapore.
Singapore is another place feeling a direct impact from U.S. policy. CNA reports that a company there, CCIC Singapore, had to lay off staff. And the reason given was specifically because U.S. sanctions over Iran oil shipments hit harder than expected.
Sanctions over Iran, causing layoffs in Singapore. Wow. That really shows how U.S. foreign policy decisions, even ones seemingly unrelated to the U.S.-China trade war itself, can have these tangible business consequences right there in Southeast Asia.
It's another clear example, isn't it? How these complex global policy decisions have real-world effects on businesses and people in the region. Now, in Hong Kong, we see a slightly different tone, perhaps. The head of the Trade Development Council stated that the tariff war is, quote, not the end of the world for Hong Kong companies. That's according to the SCMP.
Not the end of the world. Okay. Does the source offer any insight into why they might feel that way? Or how they're adapting?
Yes, it does suggest a degree of resilience, maybe adaptation.
Mhm.
And the SCMP notes that Hong Kong is actively working to back its startups at European events,
Ah,
which points to, a strategic effort maybe, to diversify markets, find opportunities away from the immediate tension points of U.S.-China trade.
okay, so pivoting towards Europe perhaps as one way to mitigate that risk. Makes sense. And what about Thailand? We see reports in the Bangkok Post covering domestic stuff, politics, economic indicators. But is there anything specifically linked back to the trade war?
Yes, there is. One source in the Bangkok Post mentions that the troubles, the woes of the Chinese EV maker Neta, they actually pose a threat to Thai car dealers.
How so?
Well, it's presented as a specific localized example of how challenges facing a Chinese company, which could be linked to broader global competition or market shifts, maybe influenced by the trade climate, can directly impact local businesses and supply chains right there in Southeast Asia.
So issues for a Chinese company creating real problems for dealers down the road in Thailand. Another specific ripple effect.
Exactly. And the Bangkok Post also notes that foreign investors in Thailand, they're seeking clear policies amidst all the volatility. Now, while volatility has many sources, you have to think the uncertainty generated by global trade disputes, like the U.S.-China tariff war, it undoubtedly exacerbates that feeling, makes investors more hesitant.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, uncertainty is just kryptonite for investors, isn't it? We also see other reports in your sources pointing to the broader security picture in the region, which maybe not direct tariff impacts, but they certainly add to this complex environment everyone's operating in.
Yes, absolutely. The sources include reports like an explosion at a U.S. airbase in southern Japan. It injured some Japanese soldiers. That was reported by AP and CNA. And separately, a Chinese aircraft carrier group entered Japan's economic waters before conducting drills. That was noted by AP, Taipei Times, and CNA.
Right. These aren't tariff issues per se, but they really highlight the underlying geopolitical dynamics, the military posturing that's all happening concurrently with these economic tensions. It's all mixed together.
Precisely. They're part of that larger, very complex security and political picture in the Asia-Pacific, a region that's clearly navigating significant pressures on multiple fronts right now.
And we also noted the U.S. implementing a new travel ban that, for the first time, affects Southeast Asia, specifically mentioning Myanmar, according to CNA and the BBC.
That's another example, right? A direct, non-economic impact of U.S. policy affecting people in the region. It just adds another layer to how these external dynamics influence countries there.
So, okay, let's try to bring it all together then. We've taken quite a deep dive into your sources on Asia Pacific news today with a real sharp focus on this US-China tariff war and its wide-ranging impacts.
Yeah, we've seen the precarious state of those trade talks happening in London. We've seen
Right.
the direct economic hits, like that really significant drop in China's exports to the U.S. And critically, I think we've seen how these tensions aren't just contained between the U.S. and China, but they create these tangible ripple effects across the whole region.
And those ripples, they show up in really specific tactical moves, don't they? Like Taiwan's front-loaded shipments trying to beat potential tariffs. We see the geopolitical maneuvering playing out in places like Vietnam, and clear business impacts and strategic adaptations happening in economies like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Thailand.
And understanding these connections, these threads, it really helps you see that these global events like the U.S.-China trade rivalry, they aren't just abstract headlines happening over there. They have concrete consequences. They create these complex, sometimes difficult dynamics for countries right across the Asia-Pacific region.